The impact tore through the passenger shuttle like lightning splitting ancient wood. Marcus gripped the armrests of the pilot's seat as the nose of the vessel pitched violently downward, the horizon spinning into a nauseating kaleidoscope of white and gray. Warning alarms screamed through the cockpit, their mechanical shrieking almost obscuring the groan of metal tearing itself apart. He'd been flying for 15 years, cargo runs, passenger transports, long-haul routes through the outer colonies, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when physics and gravity stopped being abstract concepts and became the very real force crushing his chest. "Come on, baby," he whispered through gritted teeth, wrestling with the control stick as if his willpower alone could convince the failing engines to fire. The shuttle bucked beneath him, and suddenly the endless white of the planetary surface rushed up to meet him with terrifying speed. The last thing his instruments told him before the systems fried was that he was on Glycera, a moon nobody inhabited anymore, a frozen rock marked on colonial maps with a single word: abandoned. The collision came without sound, as if the impact was so catastrophic that it transcended noise. Marcus's world compressed into pure sensation, the screech of torn metal, the violent thrust of deceleration, heat and cold warring against his body, and then nothing but darkness and the fading echo of his own heartbeat in his ears. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, cold, immense, all-consuming cold that seemed to penetrate not just his skin, but his very thoughts. Pain, a sharp ache along his ribs and shoulders, the taste of copper in his mouth. His eyes fluttered open to gray-white obscurity snow. He realized his mind sluggish and struggling to process information. Snow covering the shattered viewport, snow drifting through the jagged hole in the shuttle's hull. Marcus pushed himself upright, each movement agony. His emergency suit's thermal systems were still partially functional. He could feel them working, struggling against the brutal cold. The shuttle was a tomb of twisted metal and broken dreams. The controls were dead, the engines silent. According to the last message that had crackled through before systems failed, rescue would take weeks, perhaps longer. That was assuming anyone knew where he was, assuming they cared enough to mount a rescue mission to a dead moon on the colonial frontier. He had to move. Staying in the shuttle meant dying. It took him 40 minutes to find the emergency supplies and another hour to gear up. His suit was damaged on the left side, a long gash across the thigh where metal had shredded the protective fabric. He sealed it as best he could with emergency tape, knowing it wouldn't hold indefinitely. The thermal undersuit hummed, pumping what remained of its power into the fabric, buying him time. Maybe 2 hours in this cold. Maybe less. The wind hit him like a physical force the moment he stepped outside. Glacier's atmosphere, thin and merciless, carried ice crystals that cut like glass whenever he drew breath. His visor frosted over immediately, and he had to wipe it clear every few steps. The landscape was a nightmare of white drifts of snow towering 15 feet high, crevasses hidden beneath powder, and in the distance, the dark shapes of rock formations barely visible through the swirling storm. Marcus stumbled forward, following no particular direction, trusting only that staying still meant freezing to death. His legs felt strange, disconnected from his body. The suit's heating was failing, the initial rush of adrenaline fading into something like resignation. This was how it ended, he thought distantly. Not in some heroic crash, not in a blaze of scientific discovery or romantic adventure, but alone on a dead moon, freezing to death while no one in the galaxy even knew he was here. That was when he saw a flicker of amber light in the distance, barely visible through the haze of blowing snow. Fire. Someone or something had built a shelter out here, and they had a fire burning. For a moment, Marcus wondered if he was hallucinating. The cold could do that till you create visions, trick you into following false lights deeper into the snow. But as he staggered forward, the light grew brighter, and he could make out the shape of a structure. Metal walls reinforced with something that looked like ice bricks. A vent pipe releasing thin wisps of smoke that were immediately torn away by the wind. Marcus's frostbitten hands moved of their own accord, pounding against the metal door with what little strength remained. "Hello, is anyone there? Please, I need shelter." His voice was raw from the cold, barely audible even to himself over the howling wind. Nothing, no sound from within. He tried again, hammering harder, desperation overriding exhaustion. "Please, my ship crashed. I need help." The silence that followed felt final, like a door closing on his life. Marcus's vision blurred. His fingers had gone numb 10 minutes ago, the cold creeping past the suit's defenses. He reached for the manual release on the door with clumsy fingers, half expecting it to be locked, to be another barrier between him and salvation. The mechanism was stiff with ice, but it moved. After 3 attempts that required all his remaining strength, the door hissed open and warmth spilled out like a physical presence. Marcus stumbled inside and collapsed to his knees. The heat was so intense it felt like pain, every nerve in his body screaming as dormant sensation rushed back. He gasped, unable to control his breathing, tears forming on his cheeks before instantly crystallizing in the remaining cold. What the voice made him look up. A figure stood across the shelter, silhouetted against the glow of a fire pit carved into the center of the room. For a moment, all Marcus could process was the warmth and the fact that he wasn't going to die immediately. Then his eyes focused, and he froze. She was tall, perhaps 6 feet, her body wrapped in dark insulated material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her skin was an impossible shade of violet, luminous in the firelight, and her eyes, gods, her eyes were silver and enormous, currently narrowed with an expression somewhere between shock and fury. 2 curved horns rose from her temples, elegant and slightly curved backward, and her long dark hair fell in waves to her waist. Her face was beautiful in a way that made Marcus's chest tighten, angular and alien and utterly mesmerizing. And she was glaring at him like she was considering throwing him back, outside into the snow. "Well?" she demanded, her voice sharp and laced with something that might have been hostility or might have been fear. "Explain yourself, human. What are you doing on my world?" The shelter was smaller than Marcus had initially realized, perhaps 15 feet across, with a ceiling barely 8 feet high. In the flickering light of the fire pit, he could make out the details of Nyx's isolated world metal containers stacked against the walls, salvaged equipment, supplies organized with military precision. A sleeping area occupied one corner, layered with thick animal furs that looked incongruously comfortable in this desolate place. The air was thick with warmth and the smell of something cooking over the flames. Nyx stood motionless, watching him with those unsettling silver eyes, her expression unreadable. Marcus forced himself to stand, despite the trembling in his legs, the numbness slowly receding from his extremities as his body began to thaw. "My ship crashed," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold and exertion. "About 5 miles from here. Engine failure. I'm alone. I just need shelter until the storm passes and I can signal for a rescue team." Nyx's eyes narrowed further. She was studying him the way a scientist might examine a specimen under a microscope. After what felt like an eternity, she turned away from him, moving back to the fire where she stirred a pot suspended over the flames. "The storm doesn't pass," she said without looking at him. "Not for days. Sometimes weeks. And there won't be any rescue." Marcus's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "This moon is abandoned for a reason," Nyx continued, her voice matter-of-fact, almost monotone. "The storms that form in the upper atmosphere create a communications blackout. Any distress signal you sent would have been absorbed by the interference. No one is coming to save you. She finally glanced at him over her shoulder, and Marcus saw something flicker in those silver eyes. Not cruelty, but something that might have been sympathy, quickly suppressed. "My name is Nix, not that it matters. You can sleep in that corner." She pointed to an empty section of the shelter, far from where she'd indicated her own sleeping area. "Stay out of my supplies. Stay out of my way. When the storm passes, if it passes, you can leave." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He removed his damaged suit carefully, trying not to waste any of the remaining heat. Underneath, his thermal undersuit was damp with sweat and condensation, and his skin was mottled with cold-induced discoloration. Every muscle ached with a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. He positioned himself near the fire, careful not to get so close that he'd burn his already sensitive skin, and tried to let his body relax for the first time since the crash. Nix handed him a container of food, without comment, a thick stew of vegetables, and something that might have been meat, though Marcus wasn't about to ask questions. It was hot and filling, and after eating what little remained of his emergency rations during the trek to the shelter, it tasted like the most luxurious meal he'd ever consumed. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the relentless wind outside, battering against the metal walls dot, as darkness fully settled over Glycera. The temperature inside the shelter began to drop despite the fire. Marcus wrapped himself in a thin emergency blanket from the shelter's supplies, trying to preserve whatever warmth he could generate. He could see his breath, could watch it crystallize in the air before his eyes. On the other side of the shelter, Nix seemed utterly unaffected. She was dressed in her insulated clothing, and she moved around with the casual confidence of someone completely comfortable in this environment. She checked the fire, adjusted the vent to allow smoke to escape, and performed various other maintenance tasks with the methodical precision of someone who had perfected these routines long ago. "How long have you been here?" Marcus asked, unable to help himself. Nix paused in her work, not turning to look at him. 3 years? Marcus's throat tightened. 3 years? Alone? "I prefer it that way," Nix replied, but there was something in her voice that suggested the truth was more complicated than that statement. By midnight, Marcus's shivering had become violent and uncontrollable. The fire wasn't enough. The thin blanket was useless. His body temperature had dropped so low that his teeth were chattering hard enough to make his jaw ache, and no amount of curling into a ball could generate sufficient warmth. His breath came in visible clouds, and he could feel his core temperature continuing to plummet, a slow descent toward hypothermia. He was dying. Slowly, but definitely dying. Nix watched him for a long time from across the shelter, her expression troubled. Finally, with an irritated sigh that sounded almost like a growl, she stood and walked over to him. "This is inefficient," she announced. "You're a liability. Your body is shutting down." "I'm fine," Marcus managed to say through chattering teeth, though they both knew it was a lie. "You're not fine. You're freezing to death, which means I'm stuck here with a corpse, and I refuse to spend the next weeks dealing with that." She grabbed his arm without warning, her grip surprisingly strong. "Get up." Before Marcus could protest, she hauled him to his feet and dragged him toward the sleeping area. The furs there were thick and luxurious, layered several feet deep. Nix pulled back several layers and then, with a decisive motion, began removing her outer clothing. "What are you?" Marcus stammered. "Be quiet," Nix interrupted sharply. She stripped down to an inner layer of dark material and then gestured impatiently at him. "Get in the bed now." Marcus hesitated, and Nix's expression hardened into something that brooked no argument. He quickly removed his damp thermal undersuit, acutely aware of his vulnerability, and slid beneath the furs. The bed was still warm from Nix's body, and it felt like stepping into paradise. Then Nix climbed in after him. The sudden proximity was shocking. She pressed against his back, her body radiating heat like nothing Marcus had ever experienced. It wasn't just warmth, it was intense, almost burning, as if Nyx's alien physiology generated heat at a rate that far exceeded anything human. Within seconds, the violent shivering began to subside. Within minutes, sensation was returning to his extremities, painful but also blessed evidence that he was beginning to thaw. "This isn't," Marcus began. "Survival," Nyx cut him off. "That's all this is. Your human body can't maintain core temperature in these conditions. My physiology regulates heat differently. This is the most efficient solution to keep you alive until your body's systems recover enough to function independently." "Right," Marcus said quietly. "Survival." But lying in the dark with Nyx pressed against him, feeling her heartbeat against his back, hearing the slight hitch in her breathing, he suspected there might be something more happening here than either of them wanted to admit. They lay in silence for a long time, the storm howling outside like a living thing. Gradually, warmed by Nyx's body and surrounded by furs, Marcus felt his heartbeat slow, his breathing deepen. He was on the edge of sleep when Nyx spoke. "My name is Nyx," she said softly. "Not because it was given to me, but because it's what I call myself now. Before that, I had another name, but I'm not that person anymore." Marcus turned carefully in the furs, meeting her eyes. In the darkness, they seemed to glow faintly, a pale luminescence that was almost ethereal. "What happened?" Nyx was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "I fell in love with someone I wasn't supposed to. Someone from a different world, a different species. When my people found out, they gave me a choice: renounce him, or be exiled. I couldn't do it, even though I knew what it would cost me. So I came here, to the one place in the galaxy where my civilization doesn't have reach." She paused, and in the faint glow of the fire, Marcus could see the pain etched into her features. "But he never came. I waited for 3 years, and he never came. He chose his life over me." Marcus reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand. Her skin was warm, almost hot, and her fingers trembled slightly as she squeezed his. "His loss," Marcus said quietly. Nyx turned to face him fully, their bodies now separated by only a few inches. "You don't know me. You have no reason to say that." "Maybe not," Marcus agreed. "But I know what it feels like to be left behind. My younger brother disappeared 3 years ago on a research expedition to the outer colonies. He was supposed to come home for our sister's graduation. He never made it back. No one ever found a trace of him. My family's been searching ever since, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "I'm sorry," Nyx said, and she sounded like she meant it. "You know the feeling of losing someone then." "I do," Marcus said. "I know it feels like you're moving through the world like a ghost, watching everything happen around you, but never quite being part of it anymore." Nyx moved closer, until their foreheads were nearly touching. "Is that why you were out here? Are you searching for something?" "I was delivering supplies to the outer research stations," Marcus said. "My route was going to pass near Glycera, and I thought I'd at least try to see if there was any trace of my brother. Just something to check off the endless list of maybes." "It was foolish." "It wasn't foolish," Nyx said. "It was brave. You were looking for him, even knowing the odds were against you." They lay facing each other in the darkness, separated from the entire galaxy by the storm and the walls of their shelter. For the first time since she'd brought him into her bed, Marcus felt the tension ease between them. She wasn't just keeping him warm anymore. She was sharing something intimate, not physical, but emotional. A piece of herself that she'd clearly been protecting for 3 years. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me stay, for this. Nix's lips curved into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Don't thank me yet. The storm could last for days. We're going to get tired of each other very quickly. Or, Marcus said softly, we might find out we have more in common than we thought. He moved slowly, giving her every opportunity to reject him, and kissed her. It was gentle and tentative, a question posed in the darkness. For a moment, Nix was still, her silver eyes wide. Then her hands came up and wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, and she kissed him back with an intensity that made Marcus's breath catch. The kiss deepened, becoming less like a question, and more like an answer to something they'd both been asking themselves since the moment they met. Marcus's hands found their way into her dark hair, marveling at the softness of it. Nix pressed closer, her body generating such heat that Marcus felt as if he might combust. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Nix rested her forehead against his. This changes things, she whispered. Yes, Marcus agreed, his hands still tangled in her hair. It does. We barely know each other. I know, Marcus said, but I know enough. I know you're brave enough to survive alone on a frozen moon. I know you care enough to let a stranger share your heat, even though you claim to prefer isolation. I know you're capable of love, deep love, the kind that's worth sacrificing everything for. Nix pulled back to look at him, her silver eyes searching his face. And I know you're reckless enough to crash land on an abandoned moon, searching for answers about your brother, she said. I know you have a good heart. And I know that kissing you terrifies me more than anything else I've experienced in my 3 years here. Why? Marcus asked. Because I'm starting to believe that, maybe, just maybe, the universe might give me a second chance at happiness, Nix said quietly. And I don't know if I'm brave enough to take it. Marcus kissed her again, pouring into that kiss everything he couldn't express in words. As the storm raged outside, and the fire burned low in its pit, they held each other in the darkness, two souls who had found each other against impossible odds, discovering that sometimes the greatest warmth comes not from the world around you, but from another person's heart. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, Nix allowed herself to hope. The second day dawned without sun. On Glaciera, there was no day or night in the traditional sense, only the endless, gray twilight of a moon caught between the distant light of its parent planet and the cold indifference of space. Marcus woke to find Nix already gone from the bed, though the furs were still warm. She moved around the shelter with quiet efficiency, maintaining the fire and checking this structural integrity of the walls where the wind had battered through the night. Marcus dressed quickly, acutely aware of the intimacy they'd shared, the vulnerability they'd both exposed. In the light of morning, such as it was, everything felt different. The kiss replayed in his mind constantly, the way her lips had felt against his, the intensity of her eyes in the darkness. But now, watching her move about the shelter with deliberate distance between them, he wondered if she regretted it. We need to secure the northern wall, Nix said, not meeting his gaze. The wind is pushing harder than yesterday. If we don't reinforce it, we could lose the entire shelter. Of course, Marcus said, understanding that she needed to focus on survival, needed to anchor herself in practical tasks. He followed her lead without question. They worked together through the endless gray hours, using salvaged metal and rope to brace the walls, sealing gaps where snow had begun to drift through the cracks. Marcus was surprised to discover how strong Nix was her alien. Physiology granted her strength, far exceeding what her slender frame suggested. But more than that, he noticed how they moved together, anticipating each other's needs, working in perfect synchronization. Where one was weak, the other was strong. Where one hesitated, the other moved forward with confidence. By the time they finished, the afternoon had melted into something that might charitably be called evening, though the light remained unchanged. They were exhausted, their muscles aching, but the shelter felt considerably more secure. They sat by the fire, and Nix prepared a simple meal of heated food rations and water, warmed with melted ice. "Thank you," Marcus said as they ate. "For earlier. For being honest with me. I know that couldn't have been easy." Nix set down her container and finally met his eyes. "I spent 3 years alone, telling myself that solitude was better than connection, that trust only led to pain. And then you crashed into my world, literally, and you made me question everything I've convinced myself to believe." "I didn't mean to disrupt your life," Marcus said carefully. "I know," Nix replied. "But perhaps it was necessary. Perhaps I was never meant to stay alone." Before Marcus could respond, a sound cut through the howling wind, a deep, mechanical boom that made the entire shelter shudder. Both of them froze, their eyes meeting in sudden alarm. "What was that?" Marcus asked. Nix was already moving toward the door. "Stay here." "Absolutely not," Marcus said, following her. "We face it together." Nix didn't argue. She opened the door against the fierce wind, and they both stepped out into the blizzard. The snow was falling so thick that Marcus could barely see 3 feet in front of his face. But there, silhouetted against the white chaos, was the twisted shape of another spacecraft, this one partially buried in ice and snow, smoking from impact. "Another crash," Nix breathed. They rushed toward the wreckage, Nix moving with practiced ease through the deep snow, while Marcus struggled to keep pace. The ship was smaller than Marcus's shuttle, something designed for exploration rather than cargo transport. Its nose cone was crumpled, its hull breached in several places. But as they drew closer, Marcus saw something that made his heart skip movement inside the wreckage. "Someone's alive," he shouted over the wind. They worked quickly, carefully extracting a woman from the twisted metal. She was unconscious, her suit torn and bloodied, but her heartbeat was still strong. Marcus recognized the insignia on her suit. She was part of a scientific research expedition, one that would have been from approximately 3 years ago, the exact time frame when Marcus's brother disappeared. Back inside the shelter, they worked frantically to treat her injuries. Nix moved with surprising medical knowledge, cleaning wounds and administering first aid from the supplies stocked throughout the shelter. Marcus supported the woman's head, checking her breathing, ensuring her airway remained clear. Their earlier hesitation about each other evaporated entirely. They moved as a team, each trusting the other implicitly. Their combined efforts driven by the same purpose, saving this woman's life. It took hours. But gradually, the woman's breathing stabilized. She regained consciousness just as the sun, which wasn't really a sun, just the glow from the parent planet, began its barely perceptible shift toward the horizon. Her name was Kira, and she had been part of a deep space exploration team sent to investigate Glacier's unusual geological formations. As she recovered enough to speak, she told them something that made Marcus's entire body go rigid. "There's a research station," Kira said, her voice weak but growing stronger. "About 10 kilometers from here, deeper into the ice caverns. Your colleague, Dr. Devon, he was the xenobiologist on our team. He was supposed to return with us, but he refused. He said he'd found something incredible, something that would change everything about how we understand this moon." Marcus's hands shook. "Devon? You mean Marcus Devon? Dark hair, about 6'2", has a scar on his left shoulder?" Kira's eyes widened. "Yes, do you know him?" "He's my brother," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. "He disappeared 3 years ago." The shelter fell silent, except for the wind outside and the crackling of the fire. Nix's hand found his, squeezing gently, lending him strength. "What happened to him?" Marcus demanded. "Where is he now?" Kira struggled to sit up, and Marcus helped her. "When we tried to force him to leave, enforcement officers arrived. We didn't know they were coming until they landed. They took Devon into custody, said he'd been conducting unauthorized research, that he'd violated about a dozen colonial treaties. We were ordered to leave. I refused at first, but they made it clear they'd take us by force if necessary. I didn't see what happened to Devon after that. The last I saw him, they were taking him away toward the station. Marcus felt as if the world had tilted beneath him. His brother had been alive here on Glycera, and he'd been taken prisoner. For 3 years, Devon had been imprisoned in a research station 10 kilometers away. And Marcus had spent all that time searching the wrong places, never knowing how close he actually was. "We have to go," Marcus said immediately. "We have to get to the station and find him." "The storm is still too severe," Nyx said quietly, but her hand remained in his. "Going out there now would be suicide." "I don't care," Marcus snapped. "My brother is 10 kilometers away. He's been held captive for 3 years. Every moment we wait, every moment you spend dead in the snow helps no one." Nyx interrupted, not unkindly. "We will go when the storm passes. We will find your brother. But we will do it alive, not as frozen corpses." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the injustice of being so close, and yet so far. But he knew she was right. The storm was still too fierce, the visibility too poor. He'd been trained in survival protocols running blindly into. A blizzard would accomplish nothing but his own death. Over the next hours, Kira recovered enough to tell them more. She described the research station, its layout, the security systems. She explained that Devon had discovered evidence of an ancient civilization on Glycera, one that predated any known contact between human and alien species. The discovery was revolutionary, but it also meant that various governmental and corporate interests wanted to control it, to suppress it, or to exploit it. Devon was going to expose everything, Kira explained as she sipped water. He was going to reveal the truth about this moon and about the indigenous, Glaciaran species that still lives in the deep caverns. But they wouldn't let him. They made him disappear. As the endless gray twilight wore on, Marcus felt Nyx watching him. Finally, as night fell and Kira drifted into exhausted sleep, Nyx pulled him aside. "You're thinking about leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus looked away. "My brother." "I know," Nyx said, "and I understand. But I need to know something. When you find your brother, when you get your answers, what happens to us?" Marcus turned back to her, and in her silver eyes he saw the fear she'd tried so hard to hide. The fear that he would leave her behind, that their connection had only existed in the isolated bubble of their shelter, that it wouldn't survive the outside world. "Come with me," Marcus said suddenly. "When the storm passes, come with me to the station. Help me find my brother. Be part of this." "They've hunted me for 3 years," Nyx said softly. "My civilization has enforcement officers everywhere. If I step outside this shelter in daylight, if I allow myself to be found—" "Then we'll be careful," Marcus interrupted. "We'll find my brother, and we'll figure this out together. I'm not leaving you behind, Nyx. Not now, not ever. Do you understand me? You're not something to check off a list and move past. You're everything." Nyx's breath caught. "Marcus, I'm serious," he continued. "I came to this moon searching for answers about my past. But finding you has become more important to me than finding Devon. And that terrifies me, because I know it's fast and illogical and completely irrational. But it's true." Nyx reached up and pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with a desperation that matched his own. It was a kiss that promised and demanded, that gave and took in equal measure. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Nyx rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she whispered. "I don't know how it happened or if it's wise, but I love you." I love you too, Marcus said. So we'll do this together. Whatever comes next, we face it as a team. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury. But inside the shelter, Marcus and Nyx held each other close, their hearts beating in synchronization, their love a defiant flame against the endless cold of Glycera. The next morning, as the storm showed its first signs of weakening, they began their preparations. Kira was well enough to help, and together the three of them gathered supplies, charted a route to the research station, and made plans for what they would do when they found Devon. Marcus stood at the shelter's window, looking out at the white landscape beyond, Nyx's hand clasped firmly in his. The storm was moving toward its end, but a different kind of storm was about to begin, one of revelation, danger, and the possibility of uncovering truths that powerful people had worked to keep hidden. Are you ready? Nyx asked softly. Marcus squeezed her hand and turned to face her. With you by my side, I'm ready for anything. They kissed one final time before the shelter, a promise sealed in the cold of the dying storm. Tomorrow, they would venture into the unknown. But tonight, they had each other, and that was enough to face whatever the future held.